Hello, I'm Kristoffer Shields, historian and program manager at the Center on the American Governor. It is Wednesday, October 5th, 2016, and we are here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University to conduct an interview for the Governor Richard J. Hughes section of the Center's website. I'm happy to be joined today by Judge Lawrence Bilder, former Superior Court and Appellate Division judge in New Jersey, as well as a member of the Hughes administration. Judge Bilder was a secretary to Governor Hughes, as well as later a counsel to Governor Hughes, and also a close friend and personal advisor. Judge Bilder, first, thank you so much for being here today, and welcome to Eagleton.
My pleasure.
I thought maybe we could start just by getting some of your recollections of Governor Hughes in general, what it was that you thought made him a successful governor, and what we can learn from him today as we face some challenges in New Jersey.
The big thing that stands in my mind is the governor as a leader. A leader in the sense that people think of Harry Truman as being a leader. And one of the incidents that I think point up so perfectly how he understood that the buck stopped with him and that he would take advice from people and work with people, but in the final analysis, he had to make the decision, was with the Newark riots. The events happened and he went down there and he made a lot of very bold statements. But at the same time that he was making these bold statements, and at the same time that every day he was going around with the mayor and doing all the things that everybody saw, he was doing a lot of other things that were quite different. For example, very early on, I was instructed to make sure that there were supermarkets open so that mothers would get milk for their kids.
Right. And
through the whatever group it was in state government, I was able to get a hold of the A&P district manager, and he agreed to keep the A&Ps open, and he did. In fact, he was so dedicated to it that he would call a number of days in and say, "We haven't seen anybody for the last 2 hours. Could we close up for a couple hours to clean the place up?" Hughes did that on his own. That wasn't the advice of any of the people who were figuring out how to stop this.
This was in 1967, I should point out.
Yeah, I guess it was 67. It was. I can't tell you what year, but it was the Newark riots.
Second term, yeah.
What I always refer to as the disorders, but it really were riots. Mm. Another thing he did was every night he went out and visited and met with people from the community. Ray Brown, who was very big in a lawyer from Jersey City, very big in the NAACP, arranged them. And the only people that were there were the governor and myself, and the governor's driver took us there. But other than that, and often they were apartments that were pretty empty, and people just sitting around on the floor around, and talking to the governor so he could find out what was going on. And indeed, Colonel Kelly, who really ran the operation, and magnificently, I might say. I think Colonel Kelly was just a top man. He understood everything. He didn't know where Hughes was. Nobody did. And he did this every night. And towards the end of the week, I guess on Saturday, he started thinking that maybe we were the problem and not the solution. And on Sunday, we took a walk around and visited, I think, a supermarket and so forth. On Monday, my recollection is that the Newark News criticized him. The city's burning down and he's out there campaigning. Of course, he wasn't.
Criticized Governor Hughes.
Criticized Hughes, yeah. I haven't been able to find that. I did find an article by Farmer in the Trenton Times for that day in which he mentions that Hughes had been out on the street. In any event, against the advice of the state police, Colonel Kelly, and the Attorney General, and everybody, Hughes said, we're getting out. And he got out. He had concluded we weren't the solution, we were the problem. And so he made up his mind and did what he was elected to do, to be the decision maker. He did the same kind of thing that Harry Truman did when he decided to integrate the military. Didn't ask anybody, did it against the advice of everybody, because it was the right thing to do.
Would you say that was typical of Governor Hughes' leadership style in general?
I think that I don't think there were that many times when there was that much of a dichotomy. One of the decisions that people probably wonder about is this business about the Rutgers professor that was called from Vietnam.
Eugene Jennings.
And yeah, Hughes made the decision, but that wasn't a case where everybody was the other way. Quite the contrary. A number of the political advisors who you would think would be very conservative were very quick to say, you know, this is the right thing to do.
And this was during Hughes' re-election campaign.
The
correct?
re-election campaign.
Professor at Rutgers made some controversial comments about Vietnam.
Sure.
And Governor Hughes.
And it became an issue because the Republicans used that as a campaign reason to throw Hughes out.
Right. Unsuccessfully.
Huh?
Unsuccessfully.
Well, unsuccessful. I think another example of leadership is maybe when he went out earlier campaigning to raise money, a bond issue, to build places for the people we were taking care of in buildings that were just unacceptable. And, you know, one of the bad boys, Denny Carey, had a saying. He says, taxers is losers. And you can see that all the time. They'll do anything to keep from having a tax. The roads can go to hell, whatever. Hughes spent a tremendous amount of time selling the idea of getting bond issues and fixing up these places so there would be a decent place for these people that we were taking care of to take care of them, because a lot of them were unsafe buildings. He got buses and he took the press around in the buses. They didn't have all the media stuff they have now, and made everybody look at what was going on. I think that's leadership. That's not somebody saying to you, we ought to do this or we ought to do that. His motto sort of was, when in doubt, do what's right. So I think those are a couple of the examples of what I think puts him in the same category as, I say, Harry Truman, who comes to my mind.
And it's a very interesting time in New Jersey history. Governor Hughes is elected in 1961 for the first time, and then serves 2 terms, so it's much of the decade of the 60s that Governor Hughes is governor. You mentioned the bond issue. I mean, one of the challenges that he faced was that state government, I understand, was changing at this time. The population was growing. There were more demands on state government, particularly in terms of infrastructure, and the state needed revenue, frankly, in order to meet these demands. Bond issue was one way. He also supported an income tax, correct? Can you talk a little bit about his leadership?
More than support an income tax. He knew that we needed more money. And in preparation for the second term, maybe that's optimism, but in preparation for the second term, a large number of bills were prepared. And one of them was to get an income tax. Other bills at that time, which I thought were very important, were he a bill to create Department of Community Affairs, a bill to modernize air pollution. And when I say modernize, up to that time, air pollution was in terms of what's coming out the stack. So I guess they drove around and tested the stack stuff. This changed it to decide what would go into the furnace, and made a huge, huge difference. And there was a bill for water. And then there was the education, which was a big fight, to take the state colleges, which were teachers' colleges, and they were indeed. We sent people in to see what they were doing. And one of the examples was they were teaching high school chemistry because they were teaching people how to teach high school chemistry. So the courses, the whole school, the whole business was oriented towards giving us teachers for our schools. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, I think that the law even said that they had to promise they would teach if they went to school there. He wanted to change that. He wanted to create a situation in which if you had a kid and you're willing to have that kid live at home, same as they had been in high school, you couldn't afford to send them to school, but you could let them live at home, that they'd have a nearby school they could go to where they could have a real BS or BA, and for a tuition which could be met by working in the summertime when you weren't going to school. That's what the goal was.
Right.
It started really early on. During his campaign, first campaign, we learned that Union Junior College, as I recall, people were going to Union Junior College, spending a couple of years there, then going to Harvard. We thought that's pretty terrific. You know, it tells us something we ought to find out about and work out. And Hughes also, Governor Terry Sanford had an organization of national education thing, which he asked Hughes to join in. And we learned a lot from that and meeting people there. So the idea was to separate the state teachers' colleges, which had been run by the K-12 people, for good reason, because they were using that as their place to get their teachers, and to change the curriculum so they would be truly colleges, and to do things to ensure that the costs of those colleges are still within the means of people who were willing to make the sacrifice of keeping the kids at home. Sounds silly because they say now that the kids are all living at home now anyhow. But so a program was developed and legislation was prepared, which would have a Department of Higher Education. And the Department of Higher Education would have strict control over the finances that came from the legislature. None of this business of colleges going to the legislature, because we learned about that through Terry Sanford's program. President of one of the big universities said that we get our money by using football tickets with the legislature. So the program that he created by this legislation, or was prepared in the legislation, had the control at the state level, and would watch the administrative costs and whatever other costs would affect the tuition that would be charged. And that was another piece of that legislation. And all these packages were prepared during the first term. And all these packages were, I guess the best way to say is, shopped around the leaders. We don't have leaders now. But they were shopped around the leaders, and we had the votes for all this legislation.
When you say leaders, you mean leaders in the
The
legislature?
bad boys. The bad boys. Kenny and Kerry and Grossi and so forth, yes. And so we had the votes, and all the lobbying in the world wouldn't have changed anything because we had the votes. And the votes stood up except in one case. That was the income tax, the income tax. With the income tax, people from the assembly came in and said, now, Governor, if we vote for this income tax, you're really going to be able to get it? And I just ticked off for the governor, all the people that we'd spoken to. Bad boys. Well, the Sunday before the vote, some of the building tradespeople got to Dennis Carey and persuaded him that if he had an income tax, the Democrats would never be elected again.
He was from Essex County, correct?
Essex County leader. And so he held back, and he disappeared. He went to a basketball game. So we didn't get it. However, he did give us the vote we needed for a broad-based tax, because we got a sales tax. Not what Hughes wanted, but he did get it. He didn't fuss about it. We lost, okay, let's get a sales tax. And we had all the votes for the sales tax. So that was, and when I talk about the votes from the bad boys, it's, you know, Hughes ran for gun control. That was one of his things. And I remember a delegation came in and said to the governor, Governor, we can't vote for this. We've gotten thousands of cards, and we just cannot vote for this. It's a tremendous thing. But they did vote for it. And I've always thought that they voted for it because their leader told them that if they didn't vote for it, they wouldn't be on a ticket. So they didn't have to worry about whether they'd lose if they voted for it. They wouldn't even be on the ticket.
It brings up an interesting general point, because it's a very different political climate, right, in New Jersey in the 60s than it is, say, today or even 20 years ago. What was the relationship between Governor Hughes and these legislative leaders, the bad boys, as you...
The bad boys. Well, they weren't legislative leaders.
Well, not legislative leaders, true.
Well, let me back up a second. You know, if you look at the making of a president, there's a whole series of them, but the first one, in one of the chapters, maybe Illinois, maybe Wisconsin, I forget, he talks about the fact that these political leaders had their control in their local place. Leader in Newark, in Essex, Newark. And whatever they were doing, it came from there. And that they were interested in continuing to have political control in their town or county or whatever. And it helped them if they had good government at the state level and good government at the national level. So they were very helpful in passing things at the state and national level. Truman came out of that kind of an operation. Truman came out of a, I suppose they call it, corrupt political organization. And Truman was a great president, a great leader. So when we took these bills to the leaders, they looked at them and they were satisfied that this was good legislation and would be helpful to the state. And if it was helpful to the state, it'd be helpful to them. So that's at least that's how I saw it. That's how I see it. And it's interesting that apparently recently somebody's written an article in the Atlantic magazine suggesting that the fact that we don't have these leaders anymore is become very costly.
Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, I'm an amateur at this thing, so I don't really know. I'm a retired judge. And whatever politics that I know, I learned from Richard Hughes. When I went to work for him in Trenton, I'd never voted. I'd voted once in a presidential election when I was in the Navy. I didn't know how you became a Democrat or a Republican. So I learned. I listened to him. He told me lots of things because he had been a political leader, a very successful one. He and Thorne Lord put Mercer County together. It had been Republican, and they turned it Democrat. And there was a guy that used to come in to see me that said that Hughes had said, when we become Democrats, we're going to have so many jobs, we're going to have to go over to Pennsylvania to get people to fill them. And I said to the governor, is that? He says, sure, sure. So he understood politics. He was a very, very bright and a marvelous lawyer and a great judge. Great judge before, because he had left the bench. He had remarried and he couldn't afford to be a judge. But he was a very fine judge. And then, of course, he had his time as Chief Justice.
What type of law did he practice? What type of law did he practice?
Pretty general. Pretty general. He did some really good, I remember there was a big accident right down here where he represented the plaintiffs. He did a superb judge. As I recall, got a huge verdict.
So successful, very successful attorney.
Very successful. He practiced after he left the bench. He practiced with Jimmy McLaughlin in Trenton. And I practiced with a firm in Newark. He was of counsel to us. And any work he had with us, I worked with him. So that's how I really got to know him.
One thing I think is interesting about Governor Hughes, you mentioned national politics. He had a pretty strong relationship with Presidents Kennedy, President Johnson. How did he use that to help New Jersey? How did he use that as a governor?
Well, we had a Washington office. Mm-hmm. Hughes had a very small staff and always wanted to have a small staff and a very low budget. I was the Washington office. I would go down to Washington and I would visit the White House and some of the departments. And our arrangement with the congressman was if something was done for your district, you'd get credit for it. So Charlie Sandman, if they built a post office in Charlie Sandman's district, we might have arranged for it, but he'd get the post office and he'd get all the, and this was very beneficial because the bureaucracy works pretty well. The senator wants one thing, the representative wants somebody else, something else, the state wants something else, so they're free to do pretty much what they want. But if everybody wants the same thing, they have very little choice. And we had friends in these departments, a number of people who worked from New Jersey who worked in these departments, some of whom came back to New Jersey when we established, Kennedy was going to have a program, I don't know what they called it then, but it was to take care of people, put a lot of money into it. And we established a program in New Jersey which ultimately became the Community Affairs Department. And people came up from Washington into that program that had been working in departments in Washington. And I don't remember all the names. Of course, Joel Stearns was one of them, but Joel Stearns is a very dear friend of mine and was, but all these people came up.
Did you get the sense that Governor Hughes ever had thoughts or desires to run for national office?
I have no sense of that. And, you know, he went out to the convention and he had a lot to do with straightening out a lot of fights that were going on about representation. I knew nothing about that. I wasn't out there. I know nothing about it. Yeah. I was with him in Atlantic City when Johnson was there, and he was friendly with Kennedy, and he was friendly with Johnson, and we had met Johnson, as a matter of fact, when he was vice president. We'd gone. He was at the I guess the Senate office building. He had his office, and we met him a number of times there. And he knew Hughes. He knew who Hughes was, and we had good relationships with him. And Hughes went further than any of us wanted to with Vietnam.
How do you mean?
Governor Hughes went over to Vietnam. I don't remember all about it, but they did. Johnson sent him over there so he could come back and tell everybody this is a great thing we're doing. And he had in his pocket a letter from a member of our staff saying, "Don't do this. This is a terrible thing we're doing over there." Hughes was a very loyal Democrat, very loyal to the president, and very loyal to the nation. I don't think he felt he was doing anything wrong. I don't think Johnson thought he was doing anything wrong. So,
along these lines, this is something that's fairly well covered in other places, but we should talk about Glassboro, the Glassboro Summit, while we're here. Is there anything there, maybe specifically from a New Jersey perspective, the fact that it took place in New Jersey? How did that come about? What was...
Well, that's the problem. How it came about is you get different stories from different people. And my story is completely different. If you ask Steve Farber, who is also on our staff, he'll give you a completely different story. Joe Katz can no longer give you a story, but he'd give you a different story. Yeah, no, I'll give you the story that I have.
Sure.
Hughes and I were in the office, and he got a phone call. The president wanted to meet, and they didn't want to meet in Washington, and they didn't want to, so they needed someplace in between.
This was President Johnson.
Yeah, they wanted someplace in between. And initially, Hughes suggested an estate in northwest New Jersey, which one of our wealthy friends owned. And that didn't sound like a good idea to Johnson. And then the suggestion was made, we had a state college down in Glassboro. And we checked to see what was happening down there. And there really wasn't anything special. I mean, they may have had some kind of programs, but nothing that, and they liked that idea. But they said don't say anything because the announcement had to come out of Washington. Hughes was on his way to a Democratic meeting of some sort down in one of the counties down there. It may not have been Cumberland County, but it was down that way. And Hughes went there, and we waited for a phone call, and then they announced that they were going to have this thing in Glassboro, and we went down to Glassboro. That's how it happened. And I think the hero, to me, of Glassboro was Colonel Kelly, Colonel Dave Kelly of the state police. This is a town, this was a town and a college really they were going to have literally hundreds of media people there, reporters and so forth. The telephone company, in those days we had the telephone company still, brought in people from all over the country. And overnight, they had all kinds of telephone things in there so that that all these reporters were able to be connected with the world, as it were. And a lot of other things that had to be done. Finding food and place. Dave Kelly took care of everything. All you had to do was tell him what you needed and he took care of it.
And this was all done before an announcement had been made, you said, right?
Well, before, there wasn't that much time between when they decided to go there and when it happened. Sure, it happened before the president and Khrushchev got there, but it was very short. There wasn't very much time. And between the telephone company and Dave Kelly, all this stuff got put together. And I thought brilliantly. I couldn't imagine anything being done like that. But other than that, you know, what do I say about it? As I say, other people have different stories. Some of the stories are that Hughes had the idea and called the president and said, "Why don't you come to Glassboro?" And maybe they're right. I don't know. You know, it's a long time ago, and as I say, we all look at things and come out with different pictures of what we saw.
The challenge of history.
Right.
You mentioned earlier a little bit about Governor Hughes and the environment. How much was the environment an important issue for Governor Hughes? Was this something that he was focused on? What were some of his initiatives?
Well, I know we talk about environment. We passed bills, we prepared and passed bills for air pollution and water bills. Yeah. So, Community Affairs Department. So and all those bills that we prepared all passed. And the bills were given to different people. Like the education bill, I think, was given to a senator in Bergen County, and that person became the education senator. But all these bills had been prepared. So I don't recall anybody talking about environment. We talked about water, we talked about air pollution. We had a lot of help in those areas from government people.
What would you say is Governor Hughes' legacy as governor? Is there any particular...
Yeah, I'll tell you what I thought. I thought about that is that all these great things you do turn out, in retrospect, they don't last. They're not as important as you thought they were going to be, okay? The education, I thought that was a terrific thing. I read in the Bergen Record yesterday that the tuition at the state colleges is $13,000. Kid's not going to work in the summertime and make $13,000. Right. Most kids aren't going to. I also read that in the Bergen Record, it was an editorial, that they were questioning the administrative expenses, which forced all these things up. I know that these are all now universities. Well, universities to me, and I don't know nothing about it, but that spells administrative costs. And I sense that as a graduate of Harvard Law School, where I give money every year, but it seems to me it goes into administrative things and extra chairs and so forth, but not making it easier for kids to go to school. So, but as I say, it's not just an amateur looking at the thing. So that all that went out the window when Governor Whitman got rid of that. It turned all these schools loose to do with what they've done. And I'm sure there's a lot of pluses to that, but they certainly aren't schools that a kid can make money in the summer to go to school and live at home. And that's the kind of thing they're talking about now, is how we're going to get all these people to get an education without ending up with $100,000, $200,000 of debt. And I know that exists because I keep hearing about it from members of the family that are still trying to figure out how they're going to pay off these huge, huge debts. The biggest thing that seems to have lasted is the Department of Transportation. It had been a highway department, and one of the bills was a bill to create a Department of Transportation, to take the emphasis away from highways and cars. And Dave Goldberg was made the Commissioner of Transportation. And one of the things he did was created a train system. Well, that train system is running, and people are on those trains and getting, so that's something that really lasted, And I suppose that it must be that the air pollution business lasted. I don't think anybody's changed that. They're still controlling what goes in to the furnace. And you know, that's a good example, again, I think, of having the ability to get the votes ahead of time and fight the lobbyists. They really wanted to stop that. They could burn coal, and they had all kinds of programs that they're going to have devices so that they could put the coal in, but it wouldn't come out the stack. And that was that many years ago, and it's still coming out the stack when they have coal. But that couldn't be stopped in New Jersey because we had the votes. We had the votes. A senator came to me from South Jersey, and he said that a big company down there had said that somebody had come in from one of our departments and was looking around and said, well, we're going to have new laws here, and things may change around here and so forth. He was put up to it, I'm sure, and to frighten the senator into seeing whether he could get this law stopped. And I don't recall the details of the water stuff, but they probably had the same kind of thing there. But it wouldn't have mattered because, as with the gun control, we had the votes. We had the votes.
So we mentioned that it's obviously a very different political climate now than it was at the time that Governor Hughes was in office. At the same time, we're almost exactly 13 months from electing a new governor in New Jersey who's going to take over at a difficult, complex time, much as Governor Hughes did. Is there anything that our next governor, whoever it is, can learn from Governor Hughes, from studying Governor Hughes?
You're talking to the wrong person. I'm
How about in terms of leadership,
I'm just a retired judge, and I don't, you know.
Do you think there's anything, though, in his style that because he's seen as a pretty successful governor, I think, and one of the better governors in New Jersey
I think that
history.
he was one of the most successful governors. That's why I'm down here. I was really upset by the fact that people didn't seem to understand, or didn't have the opportunity when you look through to find out how really good he was. You know, he was a terrific campaigner. I always felt that he'd rather run for office than be in office. He loved it. He loved it. When I would go with him when he was campaigning at the second term, we didn't have a flotilla of cars and people with machine guns and so forth. We had a driver, a state trooper driver, and a rather luxurious car, I suppose, what you'd call it. It was sort of a limousine, but not one of these long stretch things. It was maybe a Lincoln or something like that. Not an upscale, but so forth, whatever it was. But we would pick him up in the morning at like 6 or 6:30, and we'd be on the road all day long until late in the day, when we'd stop someplace and get something to eat, because we'd been at umpteen dinners and lunches and breakfasts, but you don't eat at those things and so forth. Hughes loved people, And he loved to talk to them, and he related to them. And he was very good at names. He could go into a room and he'd meet maybe 20 people, but when he left, he'd know what each person's name was. And it lasted. It lasted. It was a marvelous ability. Lyndon Johnson had that ability. It was the same kind of ability Lyndon Johnson had. So I remember we were down in Miami, I guess, or Miami Beach for some kind of convention. And we got on an elevator, and Lyndon Johnson was there. You'd expect that Lyndon Johnson would know Richard Hughes' name. He knew my name. I'd met him at his office. But Hughes was like that. Hughes knew names, and he liked people, and he liked to relate to people. And so I always thought that he really enjoyed campaigning.
So before we conclude, we always like to ask if there's anything that we missed, if there are any stories you were hoping to tell.
Well, there's one thing that comes to my mind now that one ought to know about the Hughes administration, and it's in there. His law partner was Thorne Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Thorne Lord, I think, had been U.S. attorney, and he was a deputy attorney general, or an assistant, I guess, assistant attorney general. And Thorne Lord was the leader in Mercer County. Thorne Lord and Hughes put Mercer County together. And Hughes, of course, went on the bench, and the Thorne Lord was the leader in. Thorne Lord was really dedicated, because I got to know him pretty well, to good government and doing good things for the state. And Thorne Lord created a group which met in Princeton and had a lot of professors and professional people and people who Lord thought could bring together a lot of great ideas. A lot of the things that went into the packages that were prepared to be passed the second term came out of the Lord Committee. And the deal with the Lord Committee was a pretty good one. Whatever the Lord Committee suggested, Hughes would consider. But nobody in the Lord Committee would go out and complain if Hughes didn't do it. That was important, because you couldn't have this kind of thing where people say, well, you know, I told him to do this, and you're blowing the whistle on what the governor is doing or not doing. And that worked pretty well. It fell apart at one point, but that's not terribly important. In essential ways, it continued, because whatever the problems were in the final analysis, the Lord Committee people helped. There were people, professors in Princeton, who worked on a number of these legislation. They'd come in and we'd talk about the legislation, and they'd make suggestions with respect to the legislation. Another thing was that we always felt that Eagleton and Woodrow Wilson School were assets for the governor's office. We had a fellow named Mike Herbert who came from Eagleton Institute and worked with us. And Mike Herbert did a lot of stuff with Joel Stearns later on. So, and Hughes also had great relationships with some of the big corporations. They lent their people and their efforts and their material without cost to the taxpayers. My recollection is that New Jersey Network, this television thing, was designed by the AT&T people, Bell Labs. I think with the education business, we got some help from one of the big drug companies assigned the president assigned one of his assistants to help us with, not at any cost, it's just they were there as good citizens to do what they could to help.
Seems like one of the themes with Governor Hughes is having good relationships in lots of different places.
In every place, every place. And he always understood that he was a governor for all the people. And that whatever his personal views might be, what he did had to reflect the needs of all the people, not just whatever his personal, no matter how strong those beliefs were. That wasn't the governing principle. It was because he represented people that didn't feel that way. And a lot of that came also from being a judge. He always, a person who's a judge is or should be aloof from all of the pushes and pulls. When you go on the bench, you're not a Democrat, you're not a Republican, you're not a Catholic or a Protestant or a Jew or whatever, or not a Muslim. You're independent of the whole thing. And I'm not saying Hughes was that way as a governor, but a lot of that still lasted with him. A lot of that lasted with him. And he understood that he did things that represented what the public needed, not bad things, but things that might not completely comply with his own personal beliefs.
Well, that seems like both a particularly relevant lesson for today in today's political climate, and also a good place to end. So, Judge Bilder, I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to come down here today.
I thank you very much. I've been very, I think Hughes was just very, very important. And I think what he did was important. There's some people down the street, or where I live, that have a nephew who lives in one of these institutions. And that institution is there because of Hughes. Still going. People trying to say, oh no, they ought to be put into group homes or whatever, which of course wouldn't work. But when I see him, I think, yes, that's one of the things that Governor Hughes did, that kid's living in a decent place and is getting decent care. And that's a holdover from when Hughes had that bond issue and made sure. I think Hughes cared about people, and he cared about the less fortunate people. I think he felt an obligation to consider the less fortunate people, and I think a lot of things in his administration reflected that.